Now, I don't know whether you've ever been watching a TV series like Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad and found yourself empathizing with someone who is essentially a villain because of the way that you've connected with them emotionally. That's sort of what we're looking at today. We're looking at the theme of empathy, and we're asking the question today on Unbelievable: is empathy a virtue to be cultivated or a vice to be resisted? And joining me are two people much more capable of answering that question. My guests today are Professor Joe Rigney and Dr. Alastair Roberts. Joe is the author of The Sin of Empathy, a provocative work that argues when empathy becomes untethered from truth, it ceases to be a virtue and can even become sinful. Alastair, a fellow theologian, has written a substantial critique of Joe's work, arguing that his language has muddied important distinctions and potentially misrepresents a vital Christian posture. So, as we've been doing recently, we'll try to keep it light. Some strong disagreement without coming to blows is what we like to do on Unbelievable. And we're going to explore everything from scriptural foundations to gender roles, pastoral ethics, and theological nuance. So welcome to my guests, Joe and Alastair. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, really good. And if you're not watching on YouTube and you're only listening to the show, I'm also subtitling this show The Battle of the Beards, because not for the first time, but it's still quite rare. I have by far the worst beard on the screen in front of me. So Joe and Alastair really fighting it out for title of Best Unbelievable Beard.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's probably a side issue, and we'll tot up the points as we go along, see if there's any growth at the end. Joe, it's your first time on Unbelievable, am I correct?
It is, yes.
Welcome. And you've written this book called The Sin of Empathy, which I think it's fair to say is causing something of a stir. I do want to ask you about that very soon. But can we just define some terms? If we start at grassroots and try and build up in our explanations of stuff, what do we mean by empathy as opposed to something like sympathy?
Yeah, I think that the definition thing really is a good place to start, because the term empathy is relatively recent. It's a 20th century term in English. If you it didn't exist before that, even if the phenomenon that it referred to did. And it's a contested term. When social scientists try to study it or talk about it, they have a variety of definitions that get thrown out. So on the one hand, some define it in terms of a cognitive definition, something like taking the perspective of another. So it's a cognitive act. Others will more accent that it's an emotion sharing. So it's not just that I know I can understand what you're feeling or thinking, but that I actually, to some measure, share those emotions. So that's kind of a base definition. And then some people just use it as a basic synonym for kindness and compassion and so forth. And when I'm talking about it and I'm getting into it, it's a particular corruption of those phenomenon, in which empathy becomes untethered from what is true and what is good, untethered from reality. Because as a passion, as a human emotion, it's very powerful. And just like other passions, it needs to be governed, it needs to be on a leash. And when it's not, it can sweep us off our feet. So if you think of the ways that we can be blinded by anger or paralyzed by fear, I think the same sort of impairment can happen when we are overwhelmed by untethered empathy. So that's kind of a range. And so depending on which definition we're talking about, will determine whether we're talking about a virtue or a vice.
Yeah, so semantics is important as we start. I remember seeing an advert for your book, The Sin of Empathy, and it wasn't that my hackles went up, but I just thought, oh gosh, that's going to be a controversial one. Is it a deliberately controversial title? Before we move on to Alastair, did you pick that knowing that it was going to ruffle a few feathers?
Yeah, so I've been working on this for now 7 or 8 years, this subject. And one of my first forays into it was an interview with Pastor Douglas Wilson called The Sin of Empathy. And the title was meant to be provocative. It was meant to kind of turn heads, make people cock their eyes and go, wait, what's that about? And then hopefully through the course of the conversation and now through the course of the book, to clarify and define what I mean and what I don't mean. But yeah, it is intentionally provocative. And it's meant to be provocative in two senses: provoke thought in some, and sometimes to provoke reactions in others, because the reactions can frequently be as illuminating as the title itself.
Yeah. And for those people who are rubbed up the wrong way, presumably you just ask them to empathize with you so that
That's right.
so that they give you total license to do whatever you want.
I would never do that.
Yeah, let's bring in Alastair. Welcome to the show, sir. And we found out that Alastair and I went to the same school at the same time, albeit briefly in the 1990s. But I do not show favoritism, Joe. So fear not. Like the Lord, I do not show favoritism. Now, Alastair, you've written quite a strong critique of Joe's book. I know you've engaged with each other in the past, so you're not strangers meeting down a dark alley, but you've argued that Joe's framing swings too wildly and fails to maintain clear distinctions. Do you want to say something to that?
Yes. First of all, I should say that there are a lot of things that Joe is saying in this and the book that preceded it that I very strongly agree with. I think that he is tackling something that is a genuine problem within churches, within families, within society at large. And I wouldn't want that critique to be missed. One of the big influences upon his work, Edwin Friedman, has been incredibly important for my own thinking. And so I want people to go back and to read someone like Friedman, to take the best of Joe's critique, which I think has a lot of good in it, but then also not to go too far in the direction of rejection of empathy and many of the things that stands for. I think the point that you began with, the definition, is the place to begin. And because we're in a conversation or a context where empathy has borne a lot of importance for various people in different stipulated definitions, it is important to step back and to ask what people mean by the term, what they're trying to do with that term, and maybe understand ways in which we can make the critique obviously we might use the term in a stipulated way with a specific definition, but we want to find a way to get the point across without just raising people's hackles and causing them to react. Now, if you're reading, for instance, a writer like Brené Brown, empathy is really going to save us all. You can think about other writers who speak about empathy as the key to the political future, being able to see things from other people's perspective, being able to get past the polarization, the antagonisms, all these sorts of things. And in many cases, that sounds great in theory. In practice, it's a bit more complicated, not least because, as a number of writers have pointed out, empathy is a tricky thing because it is often a focusing emotion. You empathize with your family, you empathize with people who are closest to you, and often, in order to protect them, you lash out at anyone who is seen to be a threat. Paul Bloom and others have made this argument. And so I want to affirm that aspect of Joe's argument. I think it is really important, and there are many areas where that needs to be addressed within the church. But reading many of the writings on empathy that are out there, they seem to be concerned to maintain, for instance, boundaries. So you empathize with people, but you also maintain boundaries. You recognize that it is dangerous to just become sucked into other people's emotions. Brené Brown makes these sorts of points. Boundaries are hugely important in her approach, and that tends to get missed out of Joe's critique. I think it can almost be a stipulated definition. Empathy means this negative, dysfunctional form. And there are arguments about empathy that I think need to be engaged with a bit more carefully. Also, the arguments that are made for empathy are often about cognitive empathy, as he mentioned at the outset. Cognitive empathy, understanding people's perspective. And sometimes that includes a sort of emotional dimension that when you're dealing with a kid, for instance, you need to be able to see the world to some extent from their perspective in order to deal with them well. You need to understand, how do they experience this situation? Maybe they're feeling afraid and you're frustrated with the way that they're responding, but you need to get into their perspective upon the world, not to become absorbed into that, but to understand how they are experiencing things, address them at that level, and then calm them down. But that is an approach to empathy that I think is very helpful. But when we start off with a very polarizing definition that most people will reject, that conversation can never really get underway.
Yeah. So it is about how we define terms, isn't it? Because when we say something and our interlocutor understands something else by that, it sets the conversation off in a strange direction. It sort of demagnetizes the compass a little bit. And Joe, we'll come to you, but Alastair used the word boundaries there, and I suppose even words like boundaries are open to semantic manipulation. What some people call boundaries, other people call barricades. A boundary is a guard with a door in to show you where to safely enter, whereas a barricade is just an unbroken obstacle. Joe, Alastair's said a lot there, so I'll just let you respond as you see fit.
Yeah, I think, let's pick up where the comment you just made about the term boundaries. I do think boundaries is an important element. It's a way of getting at the idea of tethering. You're being anchored to something outside the emotions of the moment. And the loss of boundaries, and in particular in relation to empathy, is a key one. One of the things that I learned from Friedman, who Alastair mentioned, is that he was concerned less with the proper, true, timeless definition of the term empathy, but with its actual use. What was it actually doing in social systems, in institutions, in families? How is it actually functioning? And I picked that up from him, and I've kind of carried that through in my work as well, because I think when people, no one wakes up in the morning saying, I want to have no boundaries. Nobody wakes up. People have often criticized my work saying, well, the phenomenon you're describing is better termed enmeshment or codependence. And they've used these sort of psychological terms. And I think that's perfectly fine. I think those terms are great. But nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, I'm going to be enmeshed today. But what they do wake up in the morning thinking is, I'm going to be empathetic. And they will prioritize empathy, and in the name of empathy, do all sorts of very destructive and harmful things for themselves and for others. And so to connect it to the issue of boundaries, a friend, after my book came out, a friend sent me a picture from the Mexico side of the U.S. border. And the picture was of the border wall, and written in graffiti letters across the border wall was the term empathy. And I thought that was a very apt illustration of what I'm getting at in the book, because presumably the artist was trying to communicate something about the offense of this boundary, of this barrier. Having a wall between nations was an affront to something. Well, what was it an affront to? It was an affront to empathy. And so I want to say, whatever that is, that sort of thing, as a metaphor for personal relations or social contexts, is a really good illustration of what I'm getting at, in the way that we can lose ourselves in other people's feelings, and therefore maintaining those boundaries is really important. And maybe one other comment on the Brene Brown, because I think that she is a really interesting figure in all of this. And so, because part of what prompted me to get into this was a famous viral video of I believe it was a TED talk that she gave, in which she contrasted empathy and sympathy. And with sympathy being this aloof, indifferent, calloused, it breeds disconnection. It's not a helpful response to people in pain. Whereas empathy is a sacred space that stays out of judgment and lets people, gets in with their truth and gets all the way down in the pit with them in order to get in touch with my own vulnerability. And somebody put a animation to it, and so it went everywhere. I recall seeing it used in churches as a kind of training tool. What was interesting to me about that video is, on the one hand, the way that she felt perfectly free to disparage the term sympathy. So in that, like, the video could have been called The Sin of Sympathy. And yet there weren't very many Christians. In fact, Christians were uncritically sort of accepting this framing, even though the term sympathy is in your Bible. And it has a long history in the Christian tradition. Sympathy and its cognate compassion, those just mean the same thing, have this long tradition. And yet here she was saying, sympathy is bad. Sympathy is bad. Sympathy is bad. So what does that do to a Bible reader who then goes to their Bible, having been sort of absorbed that category, and then said, well, that's the bad thing. We need to do something better. We need to improve upon sympathy with this better virtue of empathy. But then the second thing that I noticed was the way that she talked about the way that empathy stays out of judgment. And there was a little bit of a relativistic note to her overall. She uses the phrases like "your truth" and "my truth."
Mm-hmm.
And I think this actually is a key dovetail for why this is an important conversation in the present circumstance, because we do live in a relativistic age that does have trouble with moral truth claims, moral claims, truths about what is ultimately good. And therefore, in that context, it's people's feelings that can become in the driver's seat. We can be led by our passions. And then when you encourage empathy, you're saying, I'm going to put this person in my emotional driver's seat, and wherever they want to go, I'll go. And I think that's the harmful. That's what I mean by the sin of empathy.
Yeah, which I suppose you would feel can lead to a sort of emotional anarchy, or anarchy of the emotions. Alastair, we'll come to you. If you don't mind, I'm going to add in a third word to form a triumvirate with sympathy and empathy, and the word compassion, from the Latin compatio, to suffer with. I wonder how you would delineate the word compassion, which is obviously a word we associate with Christ in the way he treated people. How would you delineate that from the word sympathy or the word empathy?
Well, I think a lot of the problem is there is a wide range of different approaches to people in their suffering or their needs that can be named by these terms, and it is difficult to get one particular term to do all the load bearing. Now, when you're thinking about Brené Brown's approach, I don't think that sort of approach is a theory of everything, nor is it something that explains every single move that you need to take if you're dealing with particularly someone who has a dysfunctional relationship with some aspect of sin, or some relationship is broken. You're not going to solve everything with empathy. And this is one of the strengths, I think, of the argument of Edwin Friedman, that many people think that the failures of leadership are going to be solved just by adding more empathy to the mix. And so this is not something that's central within his book. He spends about 6 pages on it. But when he talks about empathy, he gives the example of the way that Chamberlain dealt with Hitler. You can't deal with a problem like Hitler by just appeasing him.
Yeah.
You actually have to understand what he represents, a dysfunctional element who's just going to take whatever he can get. And you're not going to deal effectively with that by empathy. That doesn't mean that empathy isn't valuable and important in other contexts. And so, for instance, if you take the Brené Brown illustration, if you're dealing with a kid who's in a situation of pain, or if you're dealing with someone who's congregant who's really struggling through a situation of illness or family trauma, whatever it is, it does help to enter into their situation, not to be enmeshed in it, but to go to the point where they are and try and understand how they are seeing and experiencing things, and then speak into that situation from a position that is connected and engaged with them. And I think this is the point about sympathy, that sympathy in Scripture, I think, can include that sort of thing. It's not just that, but we're wanting to divide the reality that Scripture talks about, and it's a very variegated thing. It's discussing everything from the maternal relationship with a child to the way in which we are gentle and kind and sympathetic and compassionate, all these things with other people. And so I think the struggle is to try and deal with that in a careful way that does not cut things up into very simplified terms. And I think that's one of the concerns about the language of empathy, when it becomes this absolute critique of something dysfunctional. I do think that Friedman is right about the way that that term gets used in many contexts. I've argued on occasions in the past, and I still think it's helpful to do so to an extent, that empathy and the discourse surrounding it is really not the most helpful way to talk about how we show compassion, sympathy, how we enter into a situation with understanding and are able to bear with the weak, all these things that Scripture tells us to do. There's a lot of baggage which comes with the term empathy. It's a new term, and it's also a term that tends to be a term that is a load-bearing term for big theories of everything. And so whether it's Brené Brown or whether it's one of the other writers on empathy, or the writers against empathy, empathy is doing a lot more work than I think it's able to do as a term. And so I've argued on occasion, sometimes it's helpful to taboo terms. Say, we're not going to use this term. We're going to express what we're trying to express in other language. And because the term has become the flashpoint, maybe we need to put it on the bench for a while and work with other language. And when we do, I think we can often find there's a lot more agreement than it would seem on the surface.
Yeah.
And we can get to the points that are points of specific concern, and then also discover points of mutual concern that we share, whereas on the surface it might not seem that we do.
Yeah. So it's about load bearing. And I think you both seem to be, you seem to be understanding one another's point of view and walking a mile in the other one's shoes, which is good for a topic such as this. So what Alastair seems to be saying is that, and both Joe and Alastair seem to be saying something similar. We'll get Joe to give his thoughts in a second, but empathy is almost like one of those little stone bridges you see in lovely Cotswold villages in England that were built in the sort of 1700s for fishermen to walk over, and now have a sign attached to them to say not suitable for heavy goods vehicles. Joe, is it that you're not arguing against compassion? You're not arguing against walking a mile in someone else's shoes. You seem to be arguing against the idea that we make ourselves hostages to victimhood or hostages to other people's emotions. So again, it's about what we mean. Raymond Carver wrote that book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. This is what we talk about when we talk about empathy, Joe.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, a helpful way that I would frame it is if you have, and I use this illustration in the book, if someone's drowning in a river, drowning in quicksand, there's sort of three basic postures that we could take towards them. On the one hand, you could have, and they all work with that pathos word, that suffer word. On the one hand, you have apathy, that callousness, indifference. You just turn your back. You walk by on the other side of the road, like the men in the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's apathy. On the other hand, the other extreme, that would be a deficiency of compassion. An excess of compassion, I think, one where it's overwhelming, is if you were to jump in with both feet, leave the shore behind, and now you have two people drowning in this river. That would be, I think, what empathy is the term for that response in the modern world. And then right there in the middle, the place where we want to be, and the place where the scriptures are, is with sympathy or compassion, which I tend to use interchangeably. I think that one comes from Greek, one comes from Latin, but it's the same suffer with idea. And so that's the one where I'm going to reach into the river. I'm going to connect myself to the drowning person, but I'm also going to grab onto the shore, and I'm going to remain tethered, because that's actually what will enable me to help them get out of the pit, get out of this predicament that they're in. And so those three, that way of framing it, apathy on the one hand, empathy, by which I mean untethered empathy, on the other, with compassion and sympathy in the middle, that would be my preferred way. And if I could convince the entire world to work that way, then everything would be great. But because it's this contested term, I agree with Alastair that people have put a lot of stock. All of the eggs are in that basket. And so when you start to poke it, what's actually underneath, you discover that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye.
If you want to email us, by the way, you can, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Joe was giving an analogy about a drowning man, and how if you wanted to save a man from drowning, you would go out and you would wade out and you would grab hold of that man. You'd also make sure that you were tethered to the shore. Alastair, I'll just let you delve into that analogy. Jump into that patio painting like Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins, and tell us what you think.
I'll try and avoid using my best Cockney accent.
Yeah, and please don't get any dancing penguins in waistcoats, because it's not that sort of show.
I do think it's, in that sort of case, you do not want to be untethered from the shore. And there is a danger. You mentioned at the beginning the illustration of something like Breaking Bad, where many people who watched that show, they identified with Walter White. And as they were going through the show, and as he was breaking bad and increasingly becoming this villain, they still identified with him. They felt the feel of beaten down man who's trying to assert his masculinity, and there was a sense of catharsis in his growth in agency, and they identified with that to the point that they were justifying all sorts of evils that he was committing. That's a very good example, I think, of what Joe would be referring to as the sin of empathy. It's something that causes us to lose our moral bearings and our sense of what is true and right and good. But there are other situations that we face where there are not moral bearings that are being lost, and there's yet, in that situation, there can be an entering into the sorrow of others and the joy of others. Within Scripture, we are called to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And that's not just a matter of sympathizing or understanding from a distance their emotional state, but entering into it and being part of them. And this is one of the ways that we recognize that we are one body with people. It's the way that you feel when someone in your family is suffering. You suffer with them. And it's not just a matter of sympathy. You are tethered to them. And that tethering is not a bad thing. It's a tethering that is part of your relation to them. And I think Joe is dealing very well with the dangers of these tethering in situations where people are engaged in sin, or in situations where we're just at the whim of all these emotions that are flying around. This is one of the dangers, I think, of social media. There are so many emotions there, and there's very little boundary. I've given the illustration in the past of what Friedman is getting at, I think, is maybe something similar to skin. Our skin enables us to be within non-sterile environments without having to quarantine ourselves from them, without having to sterilize those environments, without being in constant immune reaction against those environments, or without succumbing to the environments. And as Christians, this is something that's very important within a sinful world. We want to be able to engage with the world and be present with sinners in corrupt and failed, broken situations, but without being infected by that, and to maintain what is a sort of homeostasis, this pattern within ourselves that's dictated by the love of Christ, by the peace of the Holy Spirit that's ruling in our hearts, and to yet, across the boundary, engage with people who are in very entangled situations without losing our moral bearings. And that, I think, is something that is Joe's warning about how that can go wrong, I think, is really needed. And yet, on the other hand, there are all these relationships where we are bound up with people, and it's really good that we feel their feelings with them. And you find that in a family, if someone's distant and doesn't really enter into the feelings of others, there's something wrong there. That doesn't mean that they're submerged within those feelings. It means that they can enter through a sort of imaginative engagement with those feelings. They feel sorrow when other people are feeling sorrow. And that, I think, is a particular gift that many people experience, that they're able to do that and really enter into other people's experience and suffering. That is also a liability. And it's a liability, for instance, when you're dealing in a situation where a member of your family is in grave sin, and all the struggles and sorrows that they're experiencing are entangled with that sin. They've been brought upon them by some evil that they're engaged in, or some problem that they're persisting in. And so it's working out the differences between those things and being able to navigate a situation, maintaining a good boundary, but also being able to be open to people and to have true engagement where we are able to take other people's feelings as things that we enter into and weep with and rejoice with those who are weeping and rejoicing.
Yeah, thank you. And again, we're really sort of finding the golden mean here. Aristotle's golden mean, an example of that would be that generosity is the golden mean, if you like, the golden spike, the good middle point between profligacy and stinginess. And Joe, you've been nodding away at everything that Alastair's saying, largely in disagreement on the good aspects of empathy. But Alastair, I did read your critique of Joe's work, and whilst you agreed on lots of things, and you said that empathy can't be used as a North Star for things like justice and truth, you also said some more critical things. So, Joe, I just wondered, is there anything trying to turn the temperature up just a teeny bit
Yeah.
We're still only using an air fryer here. We haven't gone outside to stoke up the Barbie. But I wonder if there was anything in Alastair's written critique of your book that you took umbrage with or would like to respond to now, with the good boundary of a screen in between you, of course.
Yeah, I think I'm assuming at some point we can talk about whether or not my critique has gone too much in critiquing empathy as left coded and gender coded. So the political and the gender dynamics, I think, was something. Maybe we can get to that a little bit later. But for now, I think it would be good to actually maybe a concrete example of what we were just talking about in the scriptures. Two instances come to mind where I think we see the dangers, even in situations like Alastair was talking about. One is the story of Job, and particularly Job's relationship to his wife, where here you have a woman who's just lost her 10 children. They were killed in this freak accident, which we know was the work of Satan, but she doesn't. And Job has lost everything. He's sitting in sackcloth and ashes, and his wife, who again has just lost 10 children, approaches him and says, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Right? And there's this kind of accusatory. Now, if you step out of that situation and you examine it, this grieving mother speaking out of her pain and anger towards God and demanding that her husband do what? Join her in her hostility to God. And I think we all feel the force of that, right? If we imagine ourselves in that circumstance, we can go, wow, it would be really difficult to resist that pull in that moment. But what Job says is, you're speaking like a foolish woman. That's absolutely wrong. You're speaking foolishly. Shall we not receive evil from the Lord as well as good? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So and that's, I think, a good example of him remaining tethered to reality and true compassion, even as he wants to share his wife's sorrow, reserves the right not to blaspheme. So that would be one example of the kind of tethering, even in a familial circumstance where the pain is really understandable, but the danger and the temptation that might be there. The other is something I've said, there's a provocative kind of statement, is that the most empathetic leader in the Bible is Aaron at the golden calf. And again, if you think about the circumstance where you have this traumatized and distressed people who were in slavery for hundreds of years and have been through the ringer with plagues and being chased by Pharaoh and crossing the Red Sea and being attacked at every whim, with Moses being their sort of God's representative in their midst, and now he's gone up in a cloud somewhere and we don't know what happened to him, and they feel unsafe, they feel angst, they feel anxiety, and they want somebody to make them feel better. And so they go to Aaron, and having witnessed the Egyptians worshiping, they say, we want gods who will go before us, gods who will protect us, give us that. And Aaron finds their distress, their trauma, their this distress intolerable, and he does the unthinkable. He builds them a golden calf in order to make them feel better in the moment, and kind of baptizes it with we'll have a feast to Yahweh, but with a golden calf involved. So there's a kind of, he's going to try to recover this a little bit, but he's basically, that would be an example of he just jumped in with both feet. He gave into their demands because he didn't remain tethered to what is true and what is good. So both of those illustrations, I think, get at the idea that even in situations where the distress and the pain is understandable, I get why they feel what they feel, how important it is to not simply allow them to be in the driver's seat. And in the book, I talk about then the flip side of this, which would be what do you do when someone's hurting? And I have these sort of 4 statements of what biblical compassion looks like. The first is, when someone's hurting, I think about these things as I'm trying to help them, is this is hard. Objectively speaking, what you're telling me is very hard. Number 2, I know you feel that way. So there's an understanding, even maybe a degree of sharing of that emotion. I know you feel that way, but without validating or affirming everything that they said. I'm not going to join them in cursing God. I'm with you in this, and I have hope. And that last one, I have hope, is where the tethering comes in. I still see Christ. He's sovereign over this. He's good in this. Even as you can't see, you're in the pit and you can't see him. I see him. And so I'm going to join you in the suffering. I can weep with you in the suffering, but I can't go, if you try to go someplace into something that's false or a lie, I can't go with you there.
Mm. Which again is still avoiding the quite trite and facile phrases such as God's got this, or your breakthrough's around the corner, which actually isn't empathy at all, is it? It's just it's a self-administered placebo by the person who really wants to feel better about their own life. So yeah, that's really good. And I did try and turn up the temperature. Unfortunately, that food has come out of the oven cold. So
Sorry.
Alastair, why don't you just really lay into Joe? Why don't you sort of mention some of the stuff that you said in your critique? And what's interesting, isn't it, that it's once you have a face-to-face conversation, and you can see the whites of other people's eyes, everything tends to soften a little bit. Those creases get ironed out. But
just get a bit more empathetic.
Yeah, I know. Imagine that. So, Alastair, why don't you raise your own point next, and maybe sort of delve into some of the stuff that you said in your written critique of Job.
Yes, I think the first thing to say is that I completely agree with his critique of Job, or the situation where someone is close to you is calling you to reject God or curse God and die, or the situation where they're calling you into idolatry. There are texts in Deuteronomy that speak about the way that you treat someone who might be your closest friend, who might be your dearest kinsman, and they're calling you into idolatry. And there's a warning: do not pity, do not allow that empathetic or that instinct of loyalty, that instinct of friendship, whatever it is, to dictate your actions at that point. At that point, you have to draw a sharp line, and that's for the sake of just integrity and holding faithfully to the Lord. But these are situations that I don't think should provide the substance of the Christian teaching on how we relate to others. I think what these are cases of dysfunction against which we need a sort of medication. And yet we are raised not on medication, but on solid food. And when Scripture talks about our relationship to those who are hurting, those who are in a situation connected to us, it tells us to rejoice with them when they're rejoicing, to weep when they're weeping, to bear with those who are weak, to be compassionate, gentle, understanding, kind, meek, patient, all these sorts of things, which tend to lead towards the sort of thing that people are talking about when they're talking about empathy. I think most people, when they're talking about empathy, are not talking about empathy as a North Star that dictates every single situation, is the watchword for all leadership. There are people who do treat it that way, but for the most part, I don't think they do. And I think most people would grant Joe's cases where it is a bad thing. And I would certainly grant those things. So I think that's the first thing, that if you start to develop an account of empathy against the dysfunctional forms of empathy, what you're doing is developing a sort of medicinal teaching, and you're starting to live on that medicine, rather than actually thinking about the positive teaching of Scripture and not trying to develop an understanding of proper use out of cases of abuse, which are not the ordinary cases. Most cases, it is good that parents can identify with their children and have a sense of their suffering and not be unable to deal with their pain, that they're paralyzed by the sense of their children might be hurt, they don't want conflict, whatever it is, but they're able to deal with that pain in an understanding way, in a way that's compassionate to the point of actually weeping with them, or not necessarily weeping with them, but feeling something of that pain with them. Now, beyond that, I think Joe's account really genders the concept of empathy. And that's not, and there's quite understandable reasons for doing that. A lot of the people who write positively about empathy treat it as primarily something that is exemplified by women. Someone like Simon Baron-Cohen, who has written a lot about empathy, treats this as a more feminine virtue. Now, there are ways in which cognitive empathy can be a more general approach that is exhibited maybe even by men more than women in certain cases. But when people talk about empathy, they tend to be talking about something that is sort of gendered. And Joe's account, I think, runs with that gendered aspect, connects it with feminism particularly. And in the process, it creates a sort of theory of everything around leadership and how you deal with these dysfunctions, which is very different from the sort of approach that Edwin Friedman, from whom he's drawing. His approach is very much dealing with a herding dynamic, of which empathy is one expression, togetherness, just appeasement, and it can be seen in loyalty, it can be seen in very male forms. And so the relationship between Chamberlain and Hitler is one of the examples that he leads with. And that's not feminine empathy, it's not the relationship between a mother and a child. So I think the gendered aspect leads to a certain sense of women being a source of a particular dysfunction within society. And that leads to also the other aspect of his approach, which is a politicized account that this is far more of a left-wing problem. Now, certainly there are those on the left who have come out with statements that the left is all about empathy. And really, it is a dysfunction on the left. The way that there's this sense that we just need to feel with people enough, enter into it, and not engage in conflict, to be able to appease. And when people bring forward their hurt feelings, just run with those and allow them to dictate how we approach a situation. That is a problem. But there are no less problems, certainly using Friedman's categories, of empathy on the right. And it's a herding dynamic that can be seen in a sort of tribalism. The sort of situation with Aaron, I don't think, was primarily that he's being a compassionate leader. He's seeing the crowd starting to feel there's unrest. They've already wanted to kill Moses. They're already a pretty fractious lot. And he feels that loyalty, avoiding conflict, capitulating to the crowd, joining with the side, that requires the action of building the golden calf. Now, that is a very different sort of thing from what Joe is describing more generally, which is a more feminine form of relationship. And then alongside that feminine form, he speaks elsewhere of the way that within a household, sort of leadership that a man should be exercising should be more like a thermostat, sets the temperature rather than just following the temperature. But there is something about the ability, I think, that women can exemplify of being able to pick up on the temperature of a group and to register that. That's a very powerful thing. And a man who does not connect to that and really attend to it and recognize its importance and value, I think it leads to huge problems in leadership. And so I think the approach that Joe is taking to leadership and empathy sets the stage for a sort of narcissistic leadership, which allows people to disengage from the feelings of others. And it feels good because they're plowing ahead and they're doing things without being held back by the feelings of others. But yet at the same time, so many of the crises within the church over the last few decades have been crises caused by male leaders, for instance, who did not attend to claims of abuse. And that attention to claims of abuse really requires an attention to those who are taking the temperature, who are feeling the temperature, and a certain sort of empathy. Now, we don't want it to be the North Star. We want leaders who are able to be the thermostat. But at the same time, that aspect of leadership can't be lost in the process. We don't want to throw out that baby with the bathwater of the sort of thing that Joe is attacking, and I think rightfully attacking.
Yeah. Well, now we're cooking. It's about time. And the temperature's certainly gone up. We've got a couple of minutes till the break, so I'm going to sort of put us all on the edge of a cliff and hang us there. We'll continue that conversation after the break. But Joe, just coming back to you briefly, I suppose we're all standing on the bones of the philosophies that have come before us, and I wonder how much you think this talk of empathy is affected by other philosophies that have sort of blended in, whether it's existentialism and their obsession with authenticity, or the idea of freedom. We had Max Jagannathan on the show a few weeks ago, and he talked about how freedom has switched. Before the Magna Carta, about 1,000 years ago, governments could do what they wanted, kings could do what they wanted, and the public had to do what they were told. It changed after the Magna Carta, but where we are now, the general consensus seems to be that governments can't just do what they want, but we can. So I wonder how much you think this sort of shifting in the idea of freedom, Joe, has impacted the conversation that we're having. And then when we come back after the break, we'll talk about whether this is about wokeness.
Yeah. So I do think that there are larger cultural currents in the 20th century. There's a reason that this term empathy was adopted and has expanded and become as dominant as it is. It is, just to step back historically and go, here's a term that was invented. It came over into English from German. It actually had to do with art appreciation, the ability to sort of put yourself in an artwork and sort of feel emotionally towards it. But then it's sort of taken over and become, as Alastair said, for many, a lodestar, a North Star in terms of their approach. And I think that two things related to this. One is, I mentioned earlier, is the relativism of modern society, which rejects boundaries. I think the other, though, more relevant one is actually the therapeutic mindset that is prevalent in the West. I actually think that one of the reasons for the strong reaction against my title is that basically what I've done is I've taken a word that's at home in a kind of therapeutic context. Empathy is a therapeutic word. And then I've taken a word that's at home in a moral framework, the word sin, and I've slammed them together in a way that jars for most people. So other people have talked about the dynamic using like a phrase like toxic empathy. A friend of mine, Ali Beth Stuckey's written a book on that with that title. And toxic empathy kind of still lives in that therapeutic world. By bringing this old-fashioned word sin into conversation, I think it really brings two paradigms collide, a therapeutic one and a classical moral one. And I think that's part of where the reaction comes from.
Joe, before the break, Alastair was speaking very cogently, and he agrees with you that empathy is not just a one-size-fits-all response. And I think what's really coming out is that this is a real pastoral issue. There will be lots of Christians listening who just don't know what to do in the face of this rising tide of sort of untethered feelings. I know from having researched you a little bit that actually there would be some people who would just say the reason Joe Rigney is saying this is because he's anti-woke, he's anti-women, which in itself is just an insult. It's not it doesn't show any sense of empathy for you or how you'd like to proceed. But we'll talk about that. Let's talk about the question of male and female and sex and feminism and how that plays into it. And is this really about that?
Yeah, so let's start there with the idea of wokeness or kind of modern progressive leftist thought, whatever term that is. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that running underneath the various controversies around wokeness, whether it's the racial form or the sexuality form with the LGBTQ or feminism more broadly, that a common feature in all of those conflicts, whatever ideological dimension there might be, is this untethered empathy aspect. That essentially this corruption of compassion, a parasitic version of the Christian virtue, was used at an institutional and society-wide level to hijack churches, society as a whole, in order to steer it in a particular progressive direction. And that empathy was one of the main drivers of that. So that empathy for certain designated victim groups became the measure of whether you were a good person or not. And if you wanted to get somebody to do what you wanted them to do, you could accuse them of being unempathetic or being calloused or something because they wouldn't go along with it. And I think
patriarchal or a narcissist or an abuser or anything like that.
Exactly. So those labels became steering wheels by which communities and institutions were taken hostage. And the way it worked was here's a victim group, and there may have been in certain cases in the past, historical injustices, think of slavery or things like that, or claims in the present of ongoing victimization. You think about the abuse crisis that was showed up in various Christian church communions. That these things meant believe all women. It meant that you had to go wherever the victim group or their advocates wanted to take you. And as a result, you had what I've affectionately called the victimhood Olympics that we've witnessed over the last decade or so, in which people discover that the greatest victim sets the agenda for the entire institution or the society. And so there was a competition to become the greatest victim because empathy was a powerful steering wheel in the hands of activists and agitators. And so that's the political dimension, and it is the empathy dynamics that I've been talking about are as old as dirt. I suspect that coming out of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve started to manipulate each other based on their empathy. And Cain threw a pity party before God. So pity parties are as old as dirt. What was different in the modern era is the institutionalization of it, and it was done, I think, largely by the left. Which is why empathy has become a left-coded virtue. It's a virtue that people associate with progressives, and as a result, it's one that they've used to great effect in order to advance an agenda. So that's the political dimension. And then I do think I'll stop there, but we can come back and say, and woven into that is feminism as the queen of the woke, which is the title of the 5th chapter of my book.
Yeah. Oh, we're definitely coming back to it. In fact, okay. We won't leave it. Now, Alastair, I know you split your time between the States and the UK, and we have as many listeners in the States as we do in the UK. But people listening in the UK, Christians listening in the UK, would probably think, okay, but we don't see things in quite that left and right way. We are a bit more separated in our politics and our theology. So, can you unpack some of that? Can you help to sort of untie some of those knots?
Yes, so I think, first of all, there are things that I would agree with in what Joe was saying. There are ways in which the appeal to victimhood and empathy with victims has been used to manipulate and has been used in a way that has undermined the church's moral stance on a number of different issues. And it's also made it very hard to deal with issues in a way that is a bit more objective. There's a way that's a bit more grounded in principle, and very much it can be a matter of appeasement. Now, the first thing to say is that this is not something that's just a matter of the left. And Edwin Friedman's account is very much an instinct of togetherness, which is often named as empathy, but it could be loyalty, it could be togetherness, whatever. It could be staying on the same side, not punching right, whatever it is. And it has often operated in that way, in a very male and right-coded manner. And I think we've seen a lot of that within the church in recent years. And one of my concerns about this is I really believe in a lot of the criticism that's being made, particularly about the extremes of the left. But I've also wanted to see that same critique being applied consistently when those same issues apply on the right. Now, I find it interesting that in Joe's original conversation with Douglas Wilson, Douglas Wilson began the podcast or the video conversation with an introduction. He focused upon tribalism as the primary form of empathy. Now, tribalism within that context is a lot more right-coded. Now, there are certainly ways you see tribalism on the left, but it's something that clearly applies across that political divide. But then it got taken within the actual conversation far more in it's a left-coded problem, it's a feminine-coded problem. And I think that misses something very important. And within Edwin Friedman's approach, the emphasis is upon self-differentiation. And so when faced with pressures to right or left, the importance is more dig down, root yourself in the truth, develop boundaries that don't prevent you from engaging with what's surrounding you, boundaries like skin that enable you to be in a situation and engaged with people who are different and working across that without being just absorbed into their situation and lost and untethered within it. And that I've found an incredibly helpful perspective. It enables me to be in situations where there are people that disagree with me, to make those disagreements, but not just to react against or to oppose them. And it seems to me in the current context where we are so bound up and entangled with each other, particularly on social media, the tendency is to try and draw, instead of boundaries, to create front lines of battle. And so the instinct, when you see this problem on the left, the instinct is to form a battle line against woke, a battle line against feminism, a battle line against empathy. And certainly there are these dysfunctional forms. But what we need is differentiation and self-definition that enables us to be empathetic in the healthy ways that are the sort of ways that we should feel with those who are in a situation of crisis, or people who are rejoicing with them, etc. That, I think, is quite possible while resisting these dysfunctional approaches. And so what I want to see is a consistent application of this, an untethering of it from a very gendered and politicized framework, recognizing there are these left-coded problems, and those need to be spoken about quite directly, and they need to be dealt with. Likewise, there are gendered coded problems, but it's not exclusively feminine or feminist, and it's not exclusively a matter of the progressive left. And as you mentioned, within the UK, I think most of us have the experience of being in churches where there are a lot of people of goodwill, thoughtful Christians who have very different politics from us, and we manage to work across those divides and think and talk in a way that is able to navigate our differences without reacting. And that is what I would like to see more of. And I think when we are so bound up together, we tend to peel off into our different tribal camps and react against each other.
Well, the two of you are certainly navigating differences very well. But Joe, are you simply drawing battle lines? Are you simply forming a shield wall against the encroaching tide of feminism or liberalism? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think this probably is actually a real difference between Alastair and I, because I think,
which is why I'm bringing it up.
Is that there is an element of substantively we do seem to agree on a lot of the substantive matters. But I want to, I am in the book trying to apply it. So earlier he compared it to a medicinal, and I'm like, I think we're sick. I think societally we're sick. I think church we're sick. I think in the current moment, the particular mode of sickness over the last 20 years or so has been this encroaching wokeness, and this was the dynamic that it exploited. And so I am wanting to target it, apply it, take these more general universal human principles that, say, Friedman talks about, or we haven't talked about C.S. Lewis, but I drew a lot in the book from him and have learned a lot on these matters from him. Take these more general truths and apply them to the particular challenges we're facing. And so in that sense, is it culture war or a battle line? Absolutely it is. Is it applying medicine to a particular social sickness that I think is a greater threat? So granting Alastair's point that tribal dynamics, empathy to the left and to the right are both possible, and they do happen. At the macro level, I think the left has far more ably weaponized empathy in order to advance their agenda, because society as a whole has sort of adopted progressive sensibilities and so forth. So big business, and at least in the States, I'm thinking here, I confess ignorance about the politics of the tiny island across the sea. But at least in the States, big business, the media, 1.5 political parties, maybe more, and education, all of them are shot through with progressive ideology and sensibility, and therefore empathy as a progressive coded virtue has been a very effective steering wheel. And some of maybe actually this is a parallel that maybe people might resonate with, in the same way that in 2025, if someone comes in and wants to talk about diversity or equity or inclusion, there's no way for us to hear those three terms now and fail to recognize what lies beneath them. Even though the word equity, we sing the word equity in church, right? When we sing Psalms in our church, and the word equity shows up because it's in the King James Bible. And then in principle, diversity, that could be a great thing. Diversity of skills, diversity of social classes, diversity of ethnicities, that could be a good thing. But the way that those, even inclusion or welcoming and hospitality could be a good thing in its context. But the way that those three terms have been weaponized and manipulated in order to steer otherwise conservative institutions, my argument is, in the same way that you hear diversity, equity, inclusion, I want you to hear empathy that way, because that's how it's been used by the left. And then underneath that, again, maybe we'll get to the feminism piece.
Yeah, Alastair, let's keep it going. Over to you.
Well, first of all, in response to Joe's point, he still sings those psalms. There is still diversity and equity and inclusion that might occur within the general language of his church simply because it's part of the traditional language of the Psalms, of various other texts. And in the same way, empathy has these perverted uses or has these twisted uses or manipulated uses, but it's still an important part of certainly a lot of the things that are being referred to by that are an important part of the church's understanding, even if we want to maybe shelve that term for a while and work with different vocabulary. And so that's the first thing. I think the other thing is that at a certain point, if we are not bounding ourselves by context where we're able to develop positive uses of terms, we'll constantly be in a reaction against these dysfunctional uses and manipulations of particular concepts. And so I don't want the surrounding society to set the terms for our use of terms like empathy. There are ways in which that term has been used that are really unhelpful, and I don't want our understanding of what compassion or our understanding of what kindness, sympathy, these sorts of things, to be dictated by a reaction to the ways that those terms have been misused in the wider society. Much as when I sing the Psalms, I don't want to be focused upon the misuse of the term equity when I'm singing about the equity of the Lord. I want to understand that term positively. And so there's a lot of Christian vocabulary that is taken up by these sorts of terms just in general churches, in the use of the term empathy. It's not just baptizing wholesale these pagan understandings. There are misuses of the terms, and I think we can speak to those. But when we start to speak about a sin of empathy, rather than just maybe a sinful form of empathy or the sins of empathy, different ways in which it can be sinful, or toxic empathy, ways in which it can go wrong, disordered empathy, that is all something that we might speak about in terms of, let's say, friendship. We could talk about disordered friendship, the sins of friendship, a sinful form of friendship, while recognizing that friendship at its heart is a good thing that we want to pursue in its positive form. And so, first of all, we need to focus upon the good and developing that rather than reacting against the evil. And then when we're dealing with something like the dysfunctions of the wider society in relation to empathy, particularly on the left, we're able to focus near at hand as well. And we're able to see the way in which a reaction against empathy can create its own toxic dynamics. So increasingly, there have been people using the vocabulary of the sin of empathy. When anyone shows any compassion in relationship, for instance, to illegal immigrants. Now, you can hold a strong position against illegal immigration while still being compassionate and understanding and entering into the tragedy of someone who is in that situation. You can understand the situation as one that they are breaking laws, and you can want to uphold those laws and yet still enter into the suffering that they are experiencing. And so there's been a sort of counter discourse to empathy that has encouraged hardening hearts, a certain callousness to people who are in suffering. And Scripture warns about this as well. Even when we're punishing someone who's committed a serious crime, do not go over a certain number of stripes, because at a certain point you stop being able to feel for him as a fellow human being. And there is a certain concern about the misuse of the category of empathy that has led to this reaction into hardness, callousness, a reaction even into a delight in causing pain. And I think we've seen this in some of the ways that people have mocked those who have experienced heartbreak in various situations because they're coded left. And I don't want to see that as something that's feeding our hearts. I think it's quite poisonous.
Yeah. So maybe let me say something. Two things. One is Alastair mentioned earlier the text that says, "Your eye shall not pity." And so I do think there is a kind of holy callousness in certain circumstances that ought to be recovered, and that in an empathetic age is difficult to actually calibrate rightly. Or a holy hatred. Do I not hate those who hate you? That sort of text that we would want to fold that in. But I didn't want to run out of time and not mention the gender or the sexual dynamics here. So how is feminism queen of the woke? Well, wokeness, Louise Perry's made this argument really compellingly. I wish she'd have written it before I published the book. I would have quoted her. Because she's argued that the specific variety of leftism today is suited to female preferences. And she kind of highlights, that it's wokeism or leftism is a cause that appeals to compassion for the vulnerable, and women tend to be more empathetic than men. Stereotypically, if you do your bell curve, women are the more empathetic sex. It emphasizes fearful threats and women's desire for safety and risk aversion also is in play. And it's about a collective emotional experience, and women are more vulnerable to social contagions and so forth. And so, and both of those, so especially the compassion for the vulnerable and the susceptibility to emotional and social contagion are both feminine. Men can have them, but it's certain tendencies and temptations are more characteristic of each sex. Men are prone to sin in certain ways. Women are prone to sin in different ways. And so wokeism is that package. And therefore, it's no surprise that it's found a particular resonance among women, and then men, where male tendencies come into play, is that men really struggle, especially good men, struggle with unhappy and the displeasure of women, especially women that they care about. It's difficult for good men, especially good men that have been taught to be servant leaders and things like that, and the way that phrase has been kind of distorted to where a man is no longer the head of his home, but he's the head and the woman's the neck, and she turns the head wherever she wants. That kind of dynamic means that on the one hand, women, especially when it comes to like women's ordination, as they take on the role of the pastor or the priest, and they fail to guard the doctrine and worship of the church because of excessive and untethered empathy for victim groups. So you think of the ways that LGBT people have appealed to Christian empathy in order to get greater degrees of recognition, validation, and celebration. And mainline churches have gone along with that and now fly the rainbow flag. It was women leading that charge, and then men going along with it because to resist it would have made the women unhappy. And so I think those kind of gender dynamics have been pervasive in Christian churches, especially in the last, say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And it's been highly destructive in steering the church to greater unfaithfulness in both its ethics and its doctrine. And I want to say that empathy is a major part of that dynamic, but for both men and women. And I want to apply these universal truths that Alastair and I agree are real to those particular issues. Right. And notice one thing is the book's not called The Sin of Manipulation. So even though I think that empathy can be used as a tool of emotional blackmail and emotional manipulation, I'm not mainly trying to get the manipulators to stop. I'm trying to get the people being manipulated to have better boundaries, better grounding, better tethering, better foundation to Christ and his word so that they can resist the manipulations of those people.
Yeah. Just 30 seconds each, because we are pretty much at the end. Alastair, I'm going to ask you where you think Joe needs to soften, and Joe, I'm going to ask you where you think Alastair needs to toughen up a little bit. So, Alastair, 30 seconds.
I think, first of all, that Scripture calls us as men to live with our wives and women more generally, I think, in an understanding way. There are more commonly female tendencies that, if they're just allowed to run wild, will cause problems, just as there are male tendencies that will do the same thing. And it seems to me that we live in an age where these things are increasingly at odds. Men and women are in dysfunctional relationships, and they are constantly reacting against each other. So on the one hand, you have what Joe might call untethered empathy, which is this sort of feminine version as he sees it. But on the other side, there is this aggressive, harden your hearts masculinity, tribalism, and it's all over the right. A lot of the Christian nationalist movement, for instance, I think expresses this sort of impulse. And it's very cruel. In many cases, it's hardening hearts to the actual needs of women. I think it's closed often to the actual concerns of abuse that have been a huge issue on the ground for many women. And what we need to do is live with each other in an understanding way, not reacting against women, not reacting against men, but actually bring the two together.
Joe?
Yeah, I agree with the substance there, unsurprisingly. I think my biggest pushback on Alastair would be I learned a lot, actually, from reading Alastair over the years. We were both reading Edwin Friedman at the same time and kind of processing through. He's written some adaptations and applications of it. And I think he's done some really great work on the subject. And so it's like he's forged a really, really sharp sword, and then he's telling me not to use it. And I just I want to use it. I think that that's what swords are for. They're not museum pieces first. After we win the battle, we can put the sword up in a museum. But until then, we ought to use the weapons that God supplied, to use the truth, use what His Word says, in order to apply it to very concrete, specific issues in our society.
Well, that's it, listener. I think they've done very well, both of them. Incredible conversation. My thanks to Joe Rigney and Alastair Roberts for a conversation full of insight, challenge, and hopefully some clarification. Whether you're a pastor trying to care for your people or a Christian navigating the emotional chaos of our culture. Today's episode has been about something vital, how truth and tenderness belong together. If you want more conversations like this, and why shouldn't you if you've got to the end, then subscribe and check out all our content at premierunbelievable.com. I'm Andy Kind, and from me and the whole team here at Unbelievable, until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep asking the big questions. Goodbye, and God bless.